here on the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have three speakers for this panel, and followed by commentary by our own Rashid Khalidi. And I'll just give very brief introductions to the speakers and then let them sort of turn to their papers. The first paper will be by Professor Nora, who is Professor and Chair of History of Contemporary Arab World at the Collège de France. And he's published extensively on Middle Eastern, Ottoman, and Mediterranean studies, including work most recently done, 3-volume work on the history of modern Palestine, of which I think this talk will be a part of. And so today he will present by discussing the Cold War and the question of Palestine. And I think he's also promised to take the story through to the 80s, which is something that hasn't, I don't think, come up very much so far. And then we'll hear from Nora Benkorich, who is Research Associate in Chair of Contemporary Arab History, also at the Collège de France. And she will speak, she will give the first paper of 2 on the Cold War in Ba'ath, Syria. And after that, we'll have a talk by Massimilano Trentin, who teaches history of the Middle East and economic history of developing countries and international relations in Italy, Padua and Venice, respectively. And is presenting some work based on his latest published monograph, which is really on East German administration in Ba'ath, Syria. So.
Thank you. So I am not only Professor Clouseau, to Professor Stakhanov. So Cold is, we talked yesterday about the Eastern question as a pattern, and just one more idea was Theodor Herzog's clever political insight, was to understand that Zionism could exist and achieve its project only by winning the support of one or several great powers, hence the notion of political Zionism. So, Middle East, the Cold War we talked about yesterday. I don't come back to this point. And of course, Soviet Union and Zionism, it was always hostilities until the 40s, just a few moments during the Second World War. And for the US, after the British, the US discovered one of the essential aspects of the question of Palestine, which is the contradiction between domestic and world interest, one the one hand, and the interest that must be secure in the Middle East on the other hand. For moral and electoral reasons, Truman was led to support most of the Zionist claims without accepting the logical conclusion, at least at the beginning. As a result, the only major crisis in the privileged relationship between Britain and the United States grew. Indeed, with good reason, London accused the White House of irresponsibility, sabotaging its Palestinian policy. The UNI, another time. First Palestinian War. First Palestinian War is a unique case in the whole contemporary history of the Near East. All the outside forces were on one side, and this only fact occurrence during 200 years, they mean. Britain respected the international embargo and did not supply its armed allies with arms in spite of the treaties concluded with them. Soviet Union and lesser extent France provided the state of Israel with arms despite the embargo, and the US brought a diplomatic support to the new state while seeking a political solution to the conflict. The bigger loser in geopolitical terms was Britain, which became unpopular in both Israel and Arab countries. Its capacity to act was considerably reduced. For the same reason, the winner was the Soviet Union, which was unpopular for the West, thus offsetting the anti-communist wave in the Arab world after its 1948 policy. The NATO we talked about yesterday, so And in the 50s, was the question of alliance. History leaders fear the most was that Westerners might make political concessions to the Arabs with respect to the Palestinian issue in return for their integration into the Western defense system. The danger loomed closer with the Eisenhower administration, less committed to the Zionism than its predecessors, and eager to act according to the result of state. The American and the British then constructed an elaborate plan, which was not well received by all the players involved, all the more so as only some part of the plan had been disclosed to them. So we have a negative consensus. As often, the Arabs and the Israelis found themselves together in a negative consensus, which they could not openly express. They fear that through the control of armament, like through that of economy, the Westerners might impose a tight control on them, thus limiting the precious independence which they had recently acquired. Although they were anti-communist, those countries did not want to include the actual hostility of the Soviets. So it was the question of the 50s, 1955, the border wars, the frontier by that pact, convergence between the Soviets and Egypt, 1966 crisis, the whole American project collapsed, while the second Arab Israeli conflict seemed impending, which created some confusion among the American-British leaders, while the French aligned themselves with Israel, thus openly violating the Western regulation of armament. All the prior miscalculations led to the Suez crisis. Suez crisis another time, sorry. Just only 15 minutes. Struggle for Middle East, Chipil of plan, of course. Most important idea was from 1957 to 1965. The question of Palestine was in a way pushed into the background of the struggle for Middle East. Nasser entered into a kind of informal agreement with the Americans and put this question in the icebox. That's the real word used. Palestine question is in the icebox. In the opposition between the Arabs, progressive leaders, and the conservatives, Zionism was above all a rhetorical argument. Thus Nasser blamed imperialism, Zionism, and reaction. The conservative leaders responded to this attack by underlining Nasser's inactions with regard to Israel. This rhetorical fighting was also used in the internal opposition between the progressive leaders, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. It was the Arab Cold War. So, I have no time, sorry. From 1964 on, the tension between Israel and its Arab neighbors increased. Here again, the Soviet Union followed the movement rather than provoked it. It has provided Egypt with a means of sustaining the war in Yemen and then race with Israel without seeking to provoke a crisis. We talked about a few minutes before, so increasing the implication of the US beside Israel and distance from Europe at this time. The Israeli military margin of superiority, which was essential to secure the survival of the state, implied a strong external support in front of the regional hostility. The US alone guaranteed the long-term security of the state of Israel. The logic of American choice was to be found in the American domestic political life, rather cultural life too, rather than in the imperatives of foreign policy. Moreover, a direct military intervention in favor of Israel was impossible in the context of the Vietnam War. Israel had to be strong enough to be able to do without a direct American military intervention. June 1967 was the most important idea, I think. One of the reasons for the wait-and-see attitude of Israel during that period was its conviction that despite a military success, the US would not tolerate any territorial expansion, as they showed during the Suez crisis. But the Johnson administration, without prior thinking, took the fatal decision of leaving open the possibility of annexation after a political settlement. The respect of territorial integrity was thus to be established after and not before this settlement. It was on this basis that the ambiguities of Resolution 242 were established. That was how the condition of perpetuation of the conflict over several decades were created. So Nasser the attrition war, end of time, and at the same time peace process. There's sharp contrast in the situation of the 3 years that follow. The war constantly increased, the Soviet implication, and the Americans' armed deliveries to Israel. Washington interpreted the events as a vast global scheme of Soviet expansion in the region. At the same time, the Soviet Union presented the Arab agreements in the international negotiation. The essential phase took place during the first years of the Nixon administration. The US considered the Soviet position as those of the most extremist Arabs, whereas they included a return to the lines of June 45, 1967, and the establishment of the instrument of non-belligerence. Very early, the American diplomacy underlined the necessity of peace in the legal sense of the word, with diplomatic relations between Israel and the Arab countries, which was not included in the resolution. What most essential to the political consensus in Washington was to reach a political settlement which would exclude the Soviets or even force them out of the region. Two ways then became possible. The first one was William Rogers' idea, who advocated a global settlement which would reduce the Arabs' need to use the Soviets, thus also reducing the regional influence of the latter. The second one was that of Kissinger, which consisted in using Israel to punish the Arabs for using the Soviets, while suggesting that the US alone had the means to obtain from Israel the settlement which would be acceptable to the Arabs. So that to question Israel as a strategic asset during the Black September crisis, and no time to discuss the question. And October 1973, and it was the consequences of Kissinger line of no peace, no war. And the Soviet Union was forced to sustain Arab in the war, but the Soviet Union don't want this war. The Soviet was caught as in a trap. The American put an end to the discussion of the condition of a political settlement, while Moscow doubts about the capacity of the Arab armies to confront Israel. As a result, the Soviet actions were paralyzed, which increased the Arabs' lack of comfort in this no peace, no war situation. The Soviets had to resign themselves to give Egypt and Syria the means of waging a war in which we not believe and which was prepared without them. They sent desperate signals to the Americans about the necessity of putting an end to the no peace, no war situation, which only reinforced the conviction of Nixon and Kissinger that their political line of action was extremely effective. So, everyone, the step-by-step strategy, its basis was the fact that the Arabs were unable to accept the logical consequence of the process triggered by the war, the principle of territories for peace, on the normalization of the relation with Israel. Negotiating with the Americans allowed the Arabs to avoid the decisive step, while Israel won the possibility of saving enough time to re-establish its military superiority. In this context of the Cold War, the winner was the US, which made Egypt swing over to his side. And now Jimmy Carter, I'm not time, sorry. And loss of Egypt, a real trauma for the Eastern Bloc. And at the end of the 1970s, we have the situation of the arc of crisis. The protection of the oil monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula have been defined since 1935 as an American national interest and as a major component of a difficult relation with Nasser's Egypt. So, the Iranian Revolution changed everything, while radical Islamism held both the Soviet Union and the US as enemies we must be full. The American leaders proved unable to understand the new context at the time where the end of the detente marked the start of a new phase of the Cold War. With President Carter's creation of Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, meant to protect the Gulf countries, the question of determining who the strategic asset was repaired. Israel tried to have Americans believe that he had the capacity to send its forces in that region, but he had never the means nor the legitimacy to do so. On the contrary, Egypt and Jordan had the political capacity to intervene. It was necessary to provide them with the necessary armament. So that's the question of the Reagan administration. With improbable strategic consensus between Israel and the Arab, as Jordan refused to agree to the Camp David agreement, the American members of Congress refused to grant Jordan the arms he asked for. Creation of the Central Command in 1983, Israel was excluded from it, contrary to Egypt and Jordan. The US thus admitted that the military relationship between them and Israel could only be bilateral as far as technology and intelligence were concerned, and that Israel did not really expect to play the role of a strategic asset, a role which was, to a certain extent was played by Mubarak's Egypt, which knew how to reap the benefits of its geostrategic position. But this did not really matter because the cement of the relationship between US and Israel lied in the close identification of the two countries for cultural and religious reasons. The numerous friends of Israel constantly claimed that the Hebrew state was indeed a strategic asset in the Cold War, and the dissenting voices were not listened to. The Lebanon War in 1982 was presented as an anti-communist war, and the Soviet Union retaliated by accelerating Syria's rearmament. This was the last important action of the Cold War in that region. With Gorbachev, Moscow started a gradual withdrawal while claiming to still play a role in the political settlement. A purely formal satisfaction was granted to the Soviet Union during the Madrid Conference in 1981. Conclusion. The simple fact that the question of Palestine existed before the Cold War and continued well after makes the importance of this war relative. Nevertheless, the Cold War established the region as a space of international political competition after the period of British hegemony. The great powers were again caught in the 19th century logics of armament interference, the Eastern question, while turning the question of a settlement into the essential stake. Once he imposed himself as a major player in the region, the Soviet Union tried to obtain an entente between the great powers and the political settlement would strengthen its capacity to have influence over events. Conversely, the major purpose of the United States was to eliminate that influence and to re-establish the hegemony of the West and that part of the world. In order to do so, the Americans kept devising peace processes which always came up against the same difficulty, namely the Americans' weak capacity to have an influence on the choice of Israel. The same thing happened with the Soviet Union. The economic and military aid to Arab's partner did not allow it to have an influence on their domestic choices. Arab socialism was essentially a domestic one, and the Soviets always had a weak capacity to have an influence on the strategic choice of the Arab partners. The idea of a Soviet expansion establishing popular democracy as satellites of the Soviet Union was essentially a fanciful vision of the West. The Soviets never had the means and therefore the ambition to do so. Like the Americans, they were the prisoners of the alliances. They were merely those who provided civil and military aid without any real political compensation. Yes.
Yes. I will start this short presentation, which will try to be so, with a quote of a French diplomat about American diplomacy in Syria, who said, the American diplomacy is of rare stupidity. The United States don't understand anything at all. They see in Syria a Soviet satellite, like Poland. They haven't understood the nationalist dimension of the Syrian government. This retrospective analysis might seem rather harsh, but it describes pretty well the American vision of this country during the Cold War. Also, during the rule of the Baas, Syria and the Soviet Union were intimately involved with each other. Their relationship was marked less by complicity and conventional goals than by misunderstanding and divergent ambitions. To borrow an expression to Patrick's Hill, this period was a roller coaster marriage marked by numerous ups and downs. To understand Syria's relationship with the Soviet Union at this time, I recall briefly how it started. Damascus began to get closer to Moscow from 1955 onwards, after its refusal to sign the Baghdad Pact, committed to resisting communist expansion in the Middle East. Syria did so less because of a sudden sympathy for the Soviets than because of its late decision to adopt a neutralist position. But when Britain and the US encouraged Turkey to concentrate troops on Syria's border, Damascus decided to turn towards Moscow, which seemed to have the same objectives. Indeed, both were looking for security. The Syrians sought for protection against their neighbors and their former colonizer, while the Soviets fought for a forward presence in the Eastern Mediterranean to protect their black seaport from the regional buildup of American power. Moreover, like the US bloc, the Soviets quickly understood that to be in friendly terms with Syria, they had to respect its neutralist, nationalist, and anti-imperialist feelings. So soon, Syria's contacts with the Soviet Union became numerous in several fields: economic, educational, and military, and above all in armed transfers, which actually cemented the relationship. At the same time, the US became convinced that Syria was about to become a Soviet satellite. the Western hysteria about a communist takeover in Syria was so that the Americans mounted several conspiracies to try to overthrow the Syrian government. Despite of these conspiracy visions, in fact, Syria never even came close to becoming a Soviet satellite. Syria's Baathist leaders, and especially Hafez al-Assad, always remained wary of communism at home. They certainly used the communists to back up some domestic policies, like progressive reforms in the early 1960s, which aimed at weakening the traditional bourgeoisie class of Sunnis and their allies, the Muslim Brothers, who set themselves up as responsible for the tyranny of the traditional social order. They also tried to use communist ideas to fight against religions, especially Islam, which represented the main enemy for the Alawi power from the late 60s onwards. For example, in April 1967, the journal Jaysh al-Sham, People's Army, published an eloquent article which described the new man by these terms. The new man believes that God, religions, feudalism, capitalism, imperialism, and all the values which founded the whole society are but mummified dots, good for the museum of history. We don't need a man who prays, who kneels down, who begs mercy and pity to God. The new man is a socialist and a revolutionist. By no surprise, the publication of this article provoked a huge anger movement, and the Muslim brothers called for a strike in Homs, Hama and Aleppo, which lasted 4 days. So indeed, the Baathist officers sometimes used the communists and their ideas, but even when they did so, they never forgot that they were dangerous rivals, competing for the same clientele. By no doubt, the Soviets weren't blind of this situation. They were also pretty much aware that the affiliation with the Alawiya Asabiya in Arabic is a kind of sect of most of the Baathist officers had nothing to do with nationalism or socialism. Well, after this period of no good nor bad or willy-nilly relationship between Damascus and Moscow, 2 events undoubtedly brought a change of climate. The 2 wars of 1967 and 1973. After the 1967 war, Syria, like Egypt, wanted to reverse the verdict of the defeat and regain its lost territories by force or arms if necessary, while the Soviets were interested in maintaining a no-peace, no-war situation, like the US, how we say it. Indeed, they were afraid of any action which could lead to a confrontation with the Western Bloc. Furthermore, a settlement would decrease the dependence of Damascus on the Soviet support. Thus, there was neither military agreement nor coordination between Damascus and Moscow from the outset of the war. And so it was between Cairo and Moscow. The Soviets provided Syria with arms to defend itself from any Israeli attack, but no advanced weapons to be used to defeat Israel. This position first sounded to be a good deal for the Baathist officers who wanted Moscow's help against its regional enemies, especially in arms supply, but they also didn't want any interference in their regional or domestic policies. Nevertheless, they weren't unhappy about the Soviet intervention with the US to don't cross the red line when Israel, after capturing the Golan Heights, threatened to walk on Damascus. After the defeat Hafez al-Assad, at that time Syrian defense minister, convinced Moscow to equip and to train his army, including the air force, which had been destroyed during the conflict. The cooperation with the Soviets grew up while the US influence was being reduced almost eliminated. Basically, Syria became heavily dependent on the Soviets. It was still the case when Assad seized power in 1970. Obsessed with preparing for war, he did his best to reach that purpose, including a dozen visits to Moscow, to secure from the Soviet all the aid he could. But it was always tough haggling to get what he wanted. Actually, the Soviets were supporting a moderate blow to Israel, which might bring the Israeli leadership to the conference table, but certainly not one leading to an Arab victory. During the 1973 war, like during the previous one, the Soviets were still satisfied with the situation of no peace, no war, which seriously began to annoy the Syrians. In Egypt, Sadat, pretty much aware of this Soviet position, had already taken measures to break down with Moscow, notably by expelling several thousand Soviet military advisors and weapon experts in 1972. After the war, he convinced in himself that only the US could help him, so he started to work for this process. While Sadat was bargaining with the US, Damascus and Moscow both agreed to consider him as a traitor. And as both were aware of the dangers that the peace process represented for their own interest, they got closer again. In 1974, Grinko paid several visits to Damascus, and Assad visited Moscow once. However, at the same time, Assad was willing to establish some sort of balance between the two superpowers, set about restoring his relation with the US, which was achieved when Kissinger and President Nixon visited Damascus in 1974. In fact, Assad was pretty much aware that the Soviets weren't inclined to give him what he most wanted. So this lost territory, and that they weren't able to understand his foreign policy, like his intervention to rescue Christians in Lebanon in 1976. Even his good personal relationship with Andropov, which had developed in a period of relative common aims, basically the destruction of the Israeli-Lebanese agreement shortly after the Israeli-Egyptian one, was too short to lead to a perfect entente. Assad quickly realized that Gorbachev would not be the loyal ally that his predecessor had been. Thus, from the mid-80s onwards, the relationship between Moscow and Damascus got cooler and cooler. For the Soviets, who were retreating to a position of neutrality in the Arab-Israeli conflict, decided to withdraw their military support. This was a bitter blow to Damascus' long-term strategy of holding Israel in check. To sum up, the relationship between Damascus and Moscow, even in its upper moments, never led to a perfect entente, and never even became close to looking like the US-Israeli relationship. To conclude, I speak briefly about the conspiracy theories and the conspiracy visions during this Cold War period. As I said, the Americans rather had a conspiracy vision of the relationship between Damascus and Moscow at that time. They saw in Syria but a Soviet satellite. Most of the events which had little or nothing to do with their rivalry with the Soviet bloc acquired a Cold War character. The Americans had a kind of hysterical perception of the threat at that time. One may say that this conspiracy vision shaped the foreign diplomacy in the Middle East more than the facts and the events themselves. The champions in the use of conspiracy theories might be the Syrians. Indeed, most of the domestic events were always presented under Cold War light. Two examples are eloquent. I spoke earlier about the article, The Newman, published in 1967 in the bassist journal Elshakry, and which provoked a huge four-day strike led by the Muslim Brothers in most of the cities of the country. It's interesting to see that, to calm down the situation, the same journal published a few days later another article in which the Syrian authority explained that the previous article was a plot orchestrated in order to destabilize the regime. It said the writer and the editor of this article are CIA agents. This article is but the fruit of an Israeli-American plot backed up by merchants of religion and detractors of the revolution in order to open a gulf between the people and the leader. The second example is about the opposition, especially the Muslim Brothers, who led the opposition against the Ba'athist regime from its outset. During Hafez al-Assad's rule, they were systematically accused of being the right hand of the US and of their Israeli allies, used to topple the Ba'athist regime and to destroy the revolution. They did so in 1979 after the attack on the artillery school of Aleppo. A few days later, the information minister stated, after the tragedy of the artillery school, the Israelis sent us this message: if Assad wants to control the domestic situation, he should bargain with us. This despite that yet the fighting vanguards of the Muslim Brotherhood, led by Hanan Okla, claimed responsibility for the attack. They also did so in 1982 after the Hama massacre. A few days after the end of the fight, Hafez al-Assad stated, "Everybody knows that the Muslim Brothers are manipulated by the Americans and their Israeli ally. At Hama, they gave them huge arms supply. We showed this arsenal on TV." I didn't find the picture, this piece of. So these Ba'athist leaders truly believe that in this so-called collusion, it's difficult to say. They knew that at that time they had many enemies who had good reason to support an internal insurrection in order to destabilize the regime. Notably Iraq and Jordan for inter-Arab rivalry reasons. In any case, they refused to recognize officially the existence of an internal opposition. They certainly used those conspiracy theories to back up the propaganda which aimed to fight any internal subversion and to justify the repression measures. Indeed, all the internal enemies who represented the threat for the regime were accused of being partners of the US and of their Israeli ally. Muslim brothers, Ba'athists of Iraqi allegiance, Nasserists, with the exception of, needless to say, the Syrian communists, their communist enemies. Actually, it was slightly more difficult to convince people that they too were Americans right hand. But this didn't prevent Ba'athists from giving the communists the same harsh treatment. Those Ba'athists' main use of the Cold War rivalry in a domestic level was probably through the use of the conspiracy theories. Indeed, it allowed the Syrians to legitimate their domestic policies, which became increasingly difficult to defend, while the Arabist movement, which had been the pillar of Baasism, was beginning to tumble down from the early 17th onwards. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that if a Baptist official was here, he would be very proud and confirmed in his beliefs that the world turns around the great Arab nation and under the leadership of Syria. Since it deserved Syria to presentation. Anyway, me, I'm dealing in a particular special case. It is the relations and the politics and economics of the two Germanies, East and West Germanies in Syria during the 60s and the early 70s. And well, first of all, we should not overestimate the role of Syria in the Cold War, in the sense that Syria, for the two camps, always came second in the political agenda. First was Egypt. Egypt was the main asset. Syria came second. It was relevant for other things, but always came second. Anyway, studying Syria might be useful for some other aspects. And the two Germanies, the connection with the two Germanies has been interesting since it means talking about the economic dimensions of the Cold War and the competition this unleashed throughout the world. And as for the two Germanies and the German Cold War inside the bigger picture, they had their own peculiarities. First of all, they were forbidden from any direct military or major political intervention abroad. They could not wage war again. And but they portrayed themselves as champions of two different patterns of modern development. Here, with the term of modern development, I mean the basic establishment of the nation state, the central nation state is the main political unit on the one hand, and on the other hand, the industrial development. The industrial development is the main way to create wealth and to foster social change within society. That were the basics, and the two Germanies shared more or less the same theme. However, they differ for relevant aspects. First, because West Germany championed the free market economy as the best model to achieve fast and self-sustaining rates of growth, and such a laissez-faire, you can name it, stressed the need to improve competition and the local comparative advantages, both in the domestic and international markets. Whereas the GDR had a different view of modern development. And in this sense, it perfectly endorsed the ideological framework provided by the theory of the non-capitalist road to development, which was developed and approved by Moscow in 1961, and which should provide a viable model for third world states as on the road to development and possibly socialism. And this model basically advocated for the primacy of politics over economics, and was conceived as a roadmap to independence and socialism, but for the so-called progressive forces, the forces of national liberation and the revolutionary forces, and not for the others. Anyway, it advocates decentralization of state administrative and coercive apparatus, which should which would consolidate the progressive control over society and challenge the conservative forces. And the latter must be marginalized because they are tied to Western imperialism and because they would oppose anyway social reforms. And as well as they would drain national resources away from the country. And then, particularly, the state should be strengthened to become the main agent for domestic development and the social change. The state should be the main engine. And, well, you know, anyway, more or less backing to some of the similarities of the two models, two patterns of development conveyed by the two Germanies. They all share some common features anyway. So state power enhancement, reliance on technological progress, and industrialization. And they shared even one peculiar aspect. It is the relevance of training, of education, training and education. As since for them, more or less, modernity was equated with the instrumental rationality, as well as with capital and social mobility. And different, anyway, as they were, both frameworks matched with the need of technological progress and rational efficiency. And actually, the two Germanies competed rigorously in the fields of vocational education and technical training in Syria, as well as in other third world states. And along even with many other Baptists, German officials considered Erziehung zur Arbeit, that is training for work, with an ethic based on discipline, punctuality, and productivity. So the three pillars of education and training. As a crucial to the process by which the post-colonial leaders and the third world working class would learn what modernity was and how it should work, these models. Anyway, there were even many differences. First, anyway, the two camps, the two Germanies offered very different financial and technical conditions for trade, loans, and scientific cooperation, first of all. And that was particularly relevant for those states like Syria, which had not the resources, like Iraq or other countries, to pay in cash, let's say, for the machinery, for the educational training, and so on. But then there was another difference that was a very political one, as I mean it. That is, they addressed quite different social groups whose claims and ambitions increasingly clashed with one another. And here the basic question was, who was to govern the process of change, the process of development, and who was to mainly benefit from this process of change and development, and what kind of pattern of development should be invented and projected accordingly. And then, as I said, there were, anyway, even if the two Germanies conceived the state as one main pillar of development, for the GDR, the state was the main engine, the main channel through which development was to be projected and implemented. Whereas for Western Germany was just the state was an element within a more complex picture where, anyway, the free enterprise would be the main agent of development and growth. But these were the Germans, what the Germans thought. But going back to the Syrians, and here I mean, I studied Syrian politics from the period of 1963, that is when the Ba'ath party took power, to the early 70s. And this period was called, particularly after 1966, the period of where the radical factions of Syrian Baptists took power. Professor Hinnebusch wrote a book where he labeled this part of Syrian history as Damascus, as the Hanoi of the Middle East. At least what they hoped for. And no, they have created some sort of regional unity or regionalism, along with the pan-Arabism, coupled with anti-imperialism and the support for revolutionary and liberation movements throughout the world. But as a matter of fact, they basically translated, and here I mean really the concept of translation as a theory, as a practice, elaborated by post-colonial critique is really crucial to understand. Anyway, the Baptists translated the basic pillars of modernity within the boundaries of the Arab cultural heritage, shared practices, and history. In fact, in their case, they planned to concentrate power within a nation-state based on ideology and the collective party institution. And they conceived industrial development as the main engine to couple Fawda, which is a revolution, with Tharwa, which is wealth. And at the end of the day, there was a basic convergence between Ba'athist Syria and the socialist camp, particularly the East Germany. Whereas there was a parallel divergence, temporary divergence, I would say, between Syria and Western Germany, Western camp. And so the question is why? For strategic reason, and here we just heard some of the main points. The Syrian elites found themselves at odds with the Western powers, first because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We remember the centrality of the 1967 defeat, and they turned to the Soviet and socialist camp for military support, political backing, and strategic defense. As former and the late Minister of Industry, Syria, Issam Zaim, told me once, the Soviet Union was the intermediary and the guarantee for national independence vis-à-vis the diktat of the West in the region. So arms delivery, mutual profitable business, they make money anyway, and almost unconditional political support. But there were other reasons for this convergence, and because as soon as the Ba'athists staged their coup d'etat in 1963, and they entered in a bitter struggle for power against the long-established ruling elite of Syria, whose social and economic background could be found mainly in the urban merchant families, some religious authorities, and so on. Whereas particularly the leadership of the Ba'athists, the Ba'ath Party, after 1966, all had a rural background. That is, they came from the province. They came from the province, and all the books late Hanna Batato wrote about the biographies of those ruling elite, just confirm this fact. And so the GDR and East Germany provided those Ba'athists with the institutional and the organizational framework, with the machinery, the tools, to wage that war against the previous established elites. So, for example, they provided the state machinery, they provide their experience, their expertise, to reform the state machinery and the state apparatus from introducing central planning, economic central planning, to marginalize or to carve the channels of trade enjoyed and controlled by the urban merchant families. These Germans provided their expertise to reform the the security apparatus, the mukhabarat. Mukhabarat was took its origins back to the French deuxième bureau, but in the late 60s and 70s was reformed and shaped according to the East German secret services. From deuxième bureau to the Staatssicherheit, that is state security. They introduced the use of the dogs in Syria, in the Syrian prisons. Well, and but even as for the party, the other party, which was another pillar, quite important, some elements of the Baas party was reformed along the organizational framework of the East German Socialist Party, the Sozialistische Einheitsdeutschland Partei. And in the words of, once I had interviewed former present deputy national secretary of the Baas party, Abdallah Al-Ahmar, who told me, well, I asked him, why did you choose that model, the Z party instead of the SPD? Yeah. And he told me, well, because we had some problems about the Israeli conflict, but first of all, because the Socialist Party of East Germany controlled every sector and every layer of society. And that was what we wanted. That was what we wanted. And again, here, it's not that they just copied a model. They translate it. That is, they select those features and translate it back into their reality, taking what was better for them. And I think that this fact deserves quite attention, because Basamtidi, in his work about Arab nationalism, wrote about, say, okay, that's old wine in new bottles. But the shape of the bottles, in this case, the party and the state, might affect even the taste of the wine, and even the identity of those forces, and how they portray themselves and how they present themselves to the outside world. And anyway, at the end of the day, the GDR provided the Ba'athist regime with some institution which eased, to a certain degree, an upward social mobility for those groups, okay, like peasants, state employees, workers, to a certain degree, which were forbidden until then, until then. As for ideology, well, it didn't really play much a great role. I just mention one sentence reported by the GDR experts talking with President Yusuf al-Zain, which was one of the closest allies of the socialist camp. And, well, I quote, President Yusuf al-Zain would believe that he could get rid of the labor class and the Syrian communists from one day to another, just like you draw from a man his sick blood and inject him with new. That's quite an engineer. Anyway, so the key concepts I want to share with you are about this experience are the basic notion of modern development in the sense of establishment and consolidation of the nation state in developing countries on the one side, and the spread of the project of industrial development as the main engine to rise growth, economic growth, and even to change society. But that was a project that is back to Muhammad Ali, good thinking. And first concept. Second, another concept which deserves much attention, even if, I would say, to a certain degree for today politics and the dynamics in the region, is the fact of diversification. This is the Cold War, as for economics were concerned, the very existence, to a certain degree, of the socialist camp provided an alternative market for those states like Syria, which did not have much money to pay for Western technology. And that was the difference with Iraq. Access to technology, access to educational and professional training, that's crucial. A whole range of leaders and state officials went to study in the socialist camp. And they were not all communists or Marxists, not at all, absolutely not. So, then the functionality, or anyway, of these relations, in the sense that we heard about opportunism, that it's right. It was like the former Eastern German ambassador I talked to, who said, well, it was a marriage of convenience. But given the contractual nature of marriage, I said, who gained most? And I said, well, the Syrians, of course. First, because they lasted much more than us. and we didn't get back our money, first of all. And but it was a marriage of convenience, in a way, and they gained more. And second, again, another concept, very important, was the transfer and, again, the translation of institutional organizations and frameworks from the East to the Syrian South. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll hear some comments from Rashid Khalidi now, and then open up the discussion.
Okay, trying to keep you awake. I see some people are sleeping. I'm sure because of these talks, which are, to me at least, were riveting. But because it's so cold, and it's that terrible hour after lunch. I found all of these papers absolutely fascinating, and I'll just say a very few things about each one. I gather I have 10 minutes. Okay. All I want to say about Henri's paper, most of which I was in complete agreement with, had to do with, I think, your basically accurate, his basically accurate analysis of how domestic and realpolitik or raison d'etat interests went in different directions. And I think this is true both American and Soviet policy. The only time I can see it in Soviet policy is at the very beginning, after the Soviet Union recognizes Israel, and Golda Meir comes as ambassador to Moscow, and the Soviets suddenly realize that Zionism is very popular among a section of the Soviet population, when she's received rapturously in Moscow. And that triggers all kinds of anti-Semitic responses, which you actually talk about in your talk. So here you have a case of realpolitik. I mean, Stalin is not doing what he does out of any sense of the domestic situation, right? He's simply for Zionism or Jews. He's doing what he's doing for realpolitik reasons, which several people have talked about. And yet then comes this domestic thing. And I think that redounds against further Soviet support for Israel. It's obviously most clear in American policy. I don't know the Soviet side well enough. This is the only case I can think of. In American policy, it comes up again and again and again and again. The first instance is Truman, who was strongly advised by his intelligence professionals, by his military advisors, and by the State Department not to send an Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry, not to vote for partition, not to recognize the State of Israel, and again does things entirely against the advice of his advisors. And he says at one stage he brings a group of, the State Department brings a group of American representatives in the Middle East to Washington to meet with the president. He keeps them waiting for several weeks, the heads of delegations in Cairo and so forth. because they're told the president thought it would be a bad idea for him to see his State Department chiefs from Arab countries before an election, a vital election. I think it was New York. There was a key election going on in New York. I think it was actually a mayoral election in New York City. And when he sees them, he says, he listens to what they have to say, and according to the report of one of them, he says, "Gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry, I'm not going to take your advice. I have hundreds of thousands of constituents who are concerned for the future of Israel, and I don't have any Arabs who vote for me, so thank you, goodbye, go back to your post." And we see this constantly in American foreign policy, not just over Israel. That's perhaps almost excessively mentioned that this is a domestic issue. We've heard America and the mafia and Italian American domestic politics in Italy mentioned. Anyone who knows anything about the United States and Ireland will know that this is true. And anybody who's watched the last 2 weeks of Egypt will know that the American public, when it gets excited about something, suddenly asserts itself. And God help all those realpolitik policymakers who love to do their business in dark rooms and never have public opinion affect them, suddenly forced to deal with the fact that the American people want democracy, or in this case, the American people want Zionism, or whatever, or they want the IRA, or whatever it may be they may want. And so this is a constant. I think this is a constant in foreign policy, especially for a country like this. And I would suggest it's a constant for any liberal democracy. If you want to go back and look at Palmerston or other, especially liberal British foreign secretaries and prime ministers in the 19th century, they had the same problem. The last thing I would like to say about on this paper is I think you accurately talk about how the domestic element operates. It is obviously much more important, much less important under Eisenhower than it was under Kennedy and Johnson. And people have ascribed this to the fact that either Eisenhower didn't have to worry about Jewish votes, quote unquote, or Kennedy and Johnson, for whatever reason, were more attuned to certain other domestic issues. That may be true, but as you correctly point out, once Israel is able to pose as and credibly claim to be a strategic asset, there's absolutely no difference between Republican and Democratic administrations. From that point on and until the end of the Cold War, Israel is not solely able to sell itself in terms of domestic politics, but in fact primarily sells itself, and its domestic lobby argues this ferociously, as an unsinkable aircraft carrier against the Soviet Union in the Eastern Mediterranean, as a great strategic asset in the Cold War. If you know that cartoon where the Roadrunner, or I forget which one it is, one of these cartoon characters is running along, reaches the end of the cliff, and keeps running. That's what happened at the end of the Cold War. Israel was zooming along, and suddenly there was no Cold War. There was nothing to be a strategic asset for. It didn't fall. It caught the war on terror and posed as a strategic asset, but that was not terribly credible. And actually, I'm waiting to see somebody pick up on the fact that there's absolutely no strategic reason for the American-Israeli relationship. There's a domestic reason. There are shared values. There are any number of things, the history of the relationship, but there are no strategic reasons, which in fact was the case back in the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. It wasn't until after the June War, in fact, that the strategic pretext or argument really came up. Otherwise, I have nothing else to say about the paper. Very, very interesting paper. Nora's paper I found absolutely fascinating. And I agree with everything you say about the United States exaggerating the degree of identification between Syria and the Soviet Union, although listening to Massimilano's paper and the closeness between the party and the intelligence and the development models, you can see why American diplomats may have mistakenly thought that. I think that you quite accurately, both of you, in fact, talk about the different aspects, entirely different aspects of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Ba'ath regime. But I would make a distinction between the so-called neo-Ba'ath, the people who came to power starting in February 1966 and rule until November 1970, the so-called Harakat al-Sahih, when Assad carries out a coup. After the party censures Assad, he basically annuls the party. the Ba'ath Party ceases to rule Syria, in effect, with the coup of 1970. Between that period and everything that follows, they are quite different. I don't know in terms of the development model, or the mukhabarat, or the party relationship, but I do know that in terms of foreign policy, Assad, after that point, carries out a foreign policy that's much more congenial to the Soviet Union. I'll come back to that when I talk about your paper. About Nora's paper, just two things. I fully agree with you that the Ba'ath regime said absolutely anything to discredit its opponents. These regimes will say anything. I mean, we saw this, the last example of this was the extraordinary alliance of Hamas and Israel as agents of the opposition to Mubarak in regime propaganda. It's exactly as logical as what the Ba'ath said. In fact, they're identical. I mean, liars are liars, and they have no respect for the truth. They'll say anything to stay in power. However, we don't know very much about, but know a little bit about the fact that the station of the CIA in Munich did have deep-seated relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, which had its headquarters after it went into exile in a number of these countries in West Germany. Whether this was directed against the Egyptian regime only, whether this was directed against the Iraqi regime, whether this was directed against the Syrian regime, all of them or none of them, I don't know. And I have no knowledge of any archival sources on any of this. And I don't know that they had any specific relationship with any specific action that the Muslim Brotherhood may have taken in Syria. So I don't think that the CIA instigated the Hama uprising or anything like that, or that anything that Hassan Assad said about that was true. Nevertheless, I would be slightly careful about this. These are things we find out about only from memoirs. And whereas we have some memoirs from the Afghan war period, and we have some memoirs from the 50s and the 60s, or late 50s and early 60s by American former members of the intelligence service, I've never seen anything about the key period that we're all interested in, like the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s. I don't know. I only know that during the Afghan war, these old networks were activated. Well, where were they in the interim? We don't know. Were they completely dormant? Was there no connection? I don't know. I'll leave that for you to answer. You may know better than I. Perhaps you can. The last thing I want to say is I think you're absolutely right that not only the Syrians but also the Egyptians were infuriated by the Soviet unwillingness to support them in war up to the hilt. And you also talked about this, and you're right. You're both right about this. And I agree with you, something that I used to have arguments about with people in Beirut back in the day, when there still was a Soviet Union, there still was a Cold War, that the Soviet Union was afraid of the United States in the Middle East, and that this was the main reason. They did not want their clients to confront an American client, not just because they thought the American client would whip their clients, as it had done again and again and again, but also because they were afraid of a confrontation with a superior superpower that would humiliate them. So they would not only be humiliated by proxy, by having Soviet arms again shown to be inferior to American arms, but they themselves, as a superpower, might be humiliated. And that takes us up to the DEFCON 3 and the 73 war and so on and so forth. I will say one last thing about this, that the Soviets really were genuinely afraid of the Arab armies losing. And this was, I would guess, probably not just at the top, it was also institutional within the military, within the intelligence service, and so on and so forth. I remember talking to a Soviet official who told me about a military technician, an officer, who had a nervous breakdown on an airbase in Syria after seeing the MiGs that he and his colleagues had painstakingly assembled on. They'd been crated, flown in on big Antonov freighters, what are they called, transport planes, put together, and then the Israelis bombed them to smithereens. And the men had a nervous breakdown. And that kind of frustration with how poorly their clients had performed in 56 in Egypt, in 67, better during the war of attrition, and much better in 73, I think colored not just the people at the top and the marshals of the Red Army, but right down through the ranks. The last thing about Nora's paper, about the Syrian intervention in Lebanon. It was a problem for Moscow for many, many reasons, partly because of other Soviet clients. Assad wasn't just intervening on behalf of the Maronites or the Christians, he was intervening against the Lebanese National Movement, a Soviet client, the PLO, a Soviet client, and against the wishes of Iraq, another Soviet client. So basically, this was a disaster. It was a no-win situation. The last thing is, in spite of the coolness in Soviet-Syrian relations, which you're right about at the end of the 70s and into 1982, the Soviets still offered a guarantee of Syrian territory when the Israelis were about to attack in 1982. They warned the Israelis not to attack Syrian territory, and they did not. At least this is what Yevgeny Primakov said in Beirut publicly before the war. He said, do not expect that the Soviet Union will intervene on the side of the PLO or the Lebanese National Movement. There's nothing we can do if the Israelis overrun the country. We tell you now, we can do nothing. Syria is different. So, I'm sorry, I'm told I have to stop. Massimilano, I have a whole bunch of things to say. I'll say one thing, is that okay? I'm sorry. In spite of the closeness of Syria to the Soviet Union in terms of the developmental model of industrial development, in spite of the closeness in terms of the Secret Service and the party, especially, I think, during the Neo-Ba'ath period, there was a contradiction during this period. Because this was the most revolutionary, the most radical, the most unpredictable, adventurous regime, except Gaddafi, who was never controllable or predictable, that I think the Soviets ever had to deal with. And this at the time of the height of the Sino-Soviet ideological issue. So these were people that the Soviets, on the one hand, probably had a closer ideological relationship to than anybody except the South Yemenis in the Arab world. And yet, they were wild men. I mean, they sincerely believed you could start an Arab revolution by provoking Israel. They'd seen the Arab future in Algeria. People's War of National Liberation worked. And that's not a Soviet concept. That's a Chinese concept. And the Soviets were horrified. And Zoyan and Makhos and the generals who were aligned with them believed Tahdid. They believed this. So this is a terrible contradiction. This has nothing to do with what you're really talking about, but it's the background of all of this. At the same time you have the party, and at the same time you have the mukhabarat, and at the same time you have this development model, which the Soviets are very pleased with. You have these wild men in Damascus dragging the whole region. In fact, they succeeded in dragging the region into the 67 war. Sorry,